All right. Let's start with the important stuff. So, over the summer, more often than not, this was the sound that woke me up typically around 2 or 3 a.m. Now that you've experienced that, I want you to imagine what kind of an effect dealing with that for a year and a half would have on you. It's not just the waking up that gets to you, it's also the knowledge that someone is sending a weapon to kill you. I had experience with that in Iraq and Afghanistan, but I was a soldier, and that ostensibly was part of the job. But in Ukraine, it's not just soldiers. It's families, friends, and even law students that are waiting for the missiles to land on them. And sometimes they do, as I'll talk about a bit later. During my time in Ukraine, they launched a counteroffensive to claw back their territory. Russian forces detonated a massive bomb at the Novokakova Dam, creating a humanitarian and ecological disaster. Prigozhin marched on Moscow, demonstrating the internal weaknesses of the Russian state, and daily missile strikes blew apartment complexes to pieces across Ukraine. Now, the counteroffensive is making slow but steady, hopeful progress. The floodwaters have receded, Prigozhin is dead, and the Russian state holds firm, but the missile strikes are still constant. So, we have a mix of law students and professionals here, but I hope that these things are universal enough that everyone is inspired at least a little bit by parts of this talk, but there are 3 takeaways that I hope that y'all come away from this talk with. The first is what you do with the law and where you go with it is of your own making. If you are going to or already are practicing law, you have a role to play in defending and expanding the rule of law. And 3, Ukraine is important. In order to understand why traveling to places like Ukraine is important for legal practitioners, I want to introduce the country to you with some facts and a little bit of history. It's number 45 in terms of size in the world. It's got a population of about 41 million. 7 to 10 million of those people are currently refugees. Highly literate population. It's mostly a Ukrainian-speaking country, but there's also a large minority of Russian speakers. The ethnic group is mostly Ukrainian, but again, there's also a large group of Russian speakers. Not a huge economy, but big enough to have some weight. Highly religious society. It's 87% Christian. And it's actually a founding member of the UN. So the Ukrainian SSR, the precursor state, was a founding member of the UN. So there's something that stands out in this list that people might not notice at first glance, but there's a gap between languages and ethnicities. The language politics in Ukraine are complex, but this gap means that you have many Ukrainians who speak Russian exclusively. If you didn't know some of the history of that area, you might assume that ethnic Ukrainians would speak Ukrainian and ethnic Russians would speak Russian, but that goes against years of history. So I stayed in Lviv, which is a city in the west that is about as far from the front lines as you can comfortably be in the country. That means that it is also a transport hub for a lot of different things that come in and out. I arrived on the train at the border at the beginning of June and walked across. There's not a lot of screening on the way in, which was nice because I was carrying about 3 months of stuff, as I had been in our London Maymester before that, which I highly suggest for my fellow law students. But while I was there, I traveled to Kyiv for some meetings, and I also have friends from Kharkiv and Yalta, and I have friends that work in Dnipro. And these areas are important, as you'll see on the next slide. So This is a map of the front lines as they are currently, and those are the same three cities. Yalta has been occupied since 2014. Kharkiv is about 20 miles from the border, give or take, and Dnipro is hit with missiles all the time. The red areas are occupied territory, and the blue areas are places where Ukraine has returned their territory. I traveled to Kyiv several times, and I was meeting with legal professionals there. The photo on the left is one that Banksy actually did downtown, and when the artist visited Ukraine. That metal object in front of it is called a Czech hedgehog, and it's designed to stop vehicles. And so it's a kind of a play on that. The photo on the right is one that my friend sent me, and it's a patch of grass on Independence Square where people will write names of their family or friends that have died at the front on flags and put them in the ground, and this is just a portion of that field. So you get a sense of the massive amount of people that have died. But those aren't the only signs that there's a war going on. There are reminders everywhere. On the left is a sign that says, explain to children the rules of behavior with mines. There are mines and unexploded ordnance everywhere that the Russians invaded. On the right you see children inspecting a Russian armored personnel carrier that was left over from the Battle of Kyiv. So why would anyone choose to travel to Ukraine right now? When the war started, I was working in Moscow. The team I was on had limited access to information and about the war, but we knew the gist. Then and there, I knew that I wanted to work to promote rule of law in Ukraine and help rebuild Ukraine. What form that takes will hopefully be a little bit more apparent when I finish law school. But in my first semester, I attended several talks on Ukraine, hosted actually here at the Walker Institute, reached out to several academics with country expertise, and started asking where I needed to go to study Ukrainian. All of them pointed to Ukrainian Catholic University. And it's an incredibly beautiful campus, and they actually have a Vismut team that we will be competing against in Vienna next semester. But over several months, I coordinated with the university to develop a language plan that included learning Ukrainian legal terms and learning about how the legal system functions. Now, I'm lucky in that I'm an older student. I've had the experience of taking risks and getting the reward, or even having to pick up the pieces when things don't go as planned. But for all my fellow law students, and even those who are already in their careers, I strongly advocate that you try to step outside the box of what you think the law is or your current practice to try something different. Now, you don't have to go to a war zone to do that, but be on the lookout for those opportunities that get you outside of your comfort zone. But yeah, so something different that I tried, of course, was the Ukrainian language. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the language, and I think you'll understand why it's important to know about that when I'm done. But I'll also give you a quick little Ukrainian lesson as well. So Ukrainian is a Slavic language, meaning that it shares characteristics with languages like Polish, Bulgarian, Belarusian, and Russian. But while you might pick out some words and grammar, they are not mutually intelligible. The Tsars did everything they could to effectively ban the language or even deny the existence of the Ukrainian language. In the 1700s, they banned it in religious services. In the 1800s, they prohibited publication and public speaking of Ukrainian and banned it in theaters, songs, and schools. Ukrainian speakers were dismissed from jobs and punished. When the Soviets arrived, they originally encouraged the language and promoted Ukrainian comrades to alter their language and culture to make it more in line with communism. Once the Soviets realized that ethnic identities were a threat to their power, they took those same people that had willingly helped them and shot or starved them to death. After that, speaking Ukrainian could get you arrested, or worse, tortured and killed. It was derided by Russians as being the language of peasants, stupid rednecks, and country bumpkins. And you actually see this to this day in modern Russian propaganda. They claim that neither Ukrainian language nor culture exist without Russia, but the language and culture did survive. And in 1996, the Constitution affirmed Ukrainian as the official language. Now, in the west of the country, most people speak Ukrainian. In Kyiv, they speak Ukrainian but can typically switch to Russian. And in the east, where cities have been annihilated and the most civilians have been murdered, large swaths of people speak Russian. Speaking Russian or being ethnically Russian does not mean being loyal to Russia, nor does it mean you're safe from being killed by Russian forces. But what ties all of these epochs of Ukrainian language history together? It's something that's very important to us. All of these changes are driven by some form of law, whether a decree or actual legislation. And we can see the progression of a language, culture, and state through the laws that have promoted or prescribed those things. This is us. This is the power that we can't forget we have as current and future practitioners of the law. We shape our society. Of course, I can't teach you the history of the language without teaching you a few words. This phrase is really important because you will hear it, and you tend to hear it in videos from the front or at events in Ukraine. It's more like a call and response where they say the first part, Slava Ukraini, and then people respond with Heroyam Slava. And it means glory to Ukraine and glory to the heroes. But it's often used in the same way that we hear people use God bless America and God bless our troops. It's also the battle cry of Ukrainian troops. So they say Slava Ukraini, and then everyone responds Heroyam Slava. And on some of the other burned out tanks and equipment that the Russians left over in Ukraine, in Kiev, you can see in the top it says Slava Ukraini, someone wrote that on there, and Heroyam Slava on the lower one. So we know a few words of Ukrainian, and what do we do when we learn a new language? We go to court. So law in a country at war, for obvious reasons, tends to buck up against law on the front lines. Crimes that would have been unthinkable before the war are now daily occurrences. So when the war began, the activities of the courts in the east, or the occupied areas, shifted across the country. And the Lviv Regional Court actually now runs coverage for cases originating in the occupied territories. The Lychakov District Court has heard war crimes against Russians, but there will be a mile-high stack of smaller cases that will need to be adjudicated when the war ends. When I visited on this day, I visited the jail and sat in on a hearing for collaboration. The defendants were a group of state emergency service workers, emergency service employees who stayed behind in their territory when it was occupied and, allegedly, started working for the Russians. The witnesses were their former colleagues who had fled west to remain under the Ukrainian flag. The proceedings ended up being postponed because the accused are still in occupied territory. One of the witnesses is actually fighting on the front lines, and another one is simply unreachable. They maintain the cases and documentation because there may come a day when they can bring people to justice. And as we know, this is part of due process. It was actually an emotional visit because the court worker that you see up there that I was with got choked up when he started talking about how people he knew had fought and died on the front lines. On another day, I spoke with a woman who told me that her brother had been shot in the liver. And she was like ecstatic. She was like super happy about this because it was a terrible injury, but it was survivable. And that meant that it would take him off the lines for at least several months. And it was actually rare that I met someone who didn't know someone who had been killed or injured on the front lines. Talking about that, as I mentioned in the beginning, missiles do land. It's easy to become inured to constant air raids and not go to a bunker when the sirens come on because you're tired or you're working on something. Early on the morning of Thursday, July 6th, I was woken up just after 2 a.m. To the air raid siren going off. It's pretty common. When the Russians fire missiles, a lot of times the air raid systems across the entire country go off until Ukrainian air defense can determine where the missiles are going. Once they can pin it down, they send messages telling people in the regions in the paths of the missiles to head to bunkers. But as I track the chats that the Ukrainian air defense puts out, the missiles turned towards Lviv. And there had been a ton of air raids where nothing had happened. So I figured I'd just hunker down in the bathroom, The rule being you need at least 2 walls between you and the outside. And in the evenings, I kept my windows open, and so when the first missile went overhead, it was like standing next to a jet engine. Of course, that's when I got up to go to the bunker. But this was the aftermath of that attack.
Атакували калібрами з Чорного моря близько 1-ї години, і підводні, і надводні носії. Запустили ці ракети, які спершу рухались на північ.
And what he's talking about is the missiles and where they came from, and they're called Caliber missiles, and they're about 5,000-pound bombs.
Які летять такі, як Х-101, Х-555, калібри. Русла річок вони завжди використовують для того, щоб якомога далі просунулись ті ракети, щоб подолати систему протиповітряної оборони. І таким чином цього разу прямуючи.
So you can kind of get a sense of the destruction those bring. So this is the map of Lviv in more detail. This is Ukrainian Catholic University, where I was staying, and this is where the missile struck. So the university houses students, traveling scholars with their families, nuns, and priests. All of us were packed into a cozy little university basement when the Caliber missiles landed across the street. Each strike shook our building and broke doors and windows. Which is, of course, what you'd expect from a 5,000-pound bomb. The top 3 floors of that building were destroyed. In total, 10 people were killed and over 40 were injured. It was, and still is, the deadliest attack in Lviv, but by no means in Ukraine, since the start of the war. The next day, I went to the scene and snapped some pictures, and I want you to take a moment and look at the destruction, human impact that this had. And I want you to remember this happens daily all around Ukraine. So I didn't actually realize that I'd taken this picture. I was kind of taking one of the crowd, and I didn't realize that I caught this woman on the right, and she had just lost someone and was like pacing back and forth crying. The state service has psychologists. This is a psychologist that was talking with people, and she was talking with this man for a while. And here you can see some of the destruction. It blew off the top 3 floors and then blew down into the building. And people were trapped, and they were pulling them out of the rubble for hours. But I mean, immediately they were cleaning it up. And here you can see some of the destruction, all the things that had rained down into that courtyard. And they were already, within hours, they were trying to clean it up. I think in like 2 days, it was all the rubble was gone. And here, I mean, they must have been there since like 3 a.m. in the morning. So I saw this police officer, and he was like looking at me, but he like wasn't looking at me. He just had that sort of 1,000-yard stare. And so it was like he was like looking through me. But moving on to that, again, I told you that Ukraine is important. Now, our politicians in the state of South Carolina have also illuminated the need for victory in Ukraine. Congressman Joe Wilson pointed out that Ukrainian victory is good for U.S. national security and economic stability, denies Putin any reward for his invasion, and deters China and Iran. Ukraine's existence depends on victory, and that's absolutely right. Senator Lindsey Graham has also spoken out, saying that the Russian army has been dealt a severe blow. It is now time to go all in for victory in Ukraine. So when we're supporting Ukraine, we're doing it because we know that if there was a fight America was born for, or at least born to support, this is it. Because, as the joke goes, you have a massive superpower telling its former colony that it doesn't have the right to self-determination. But enough about American history, let's talk about Ukraine. It's not a very funny joke, but you get it. But the war isn't the only battle that Ukraine is fighting right now. So there's a lot of talk about corruption in Ukraine, and while it's an important topic, I think like some of it's a bit misplaced. One cause of the war is corruption. In 2014, Ukraine had an incredibly corrupt and morally bankrupt president named Yanukovych. There is even a museum of his palatial residence in Kyiv. And Ukrainians had been pushing for reform and wanted to move away from the old, corrupt way of doing business and move towards joining the EU. Yanukovych put his political opposition in prison, and refused to sign an EU association agreement that he originally had said he was going to sign. Instead, he started moving towards the Eurasian Customs Union, which Russia has been pushing on its neighbors. And when this happened, the people took to the streets, and eventually, during intense protests where over 100 protesters were shot in the streets in February of 2014, Yanukovych fled and an interim government took power. Another president, Poroshenko, was elected but fell into some of the same traps. But in the background of all of that, there was an actor playing the role of a school teacher who goes on this government rant about how he hates the government, and in the show he sort of gets elected president. And the show was called Servant of the People, and the actor was Vladimir Zelensky. Before the war, President Zelensky was actually flagging in popularity polls in Ukraine. But when it started, he did the one thing that, after so many corrupt and weak presidents, no one expected him to do. He said, if my country is under attack, I'm not leaving. Of course, this has been immortalized in his response to a request to evacuate him when he said, the fight is here. I need ammunition, not a ride. In the beginning of the war, the fight against corruption wasn't the top priority. Survival was. But in the months and now year and a half since, Ukraine's National Anti-Corruption Bureau, or NABU for short, and Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, SAP, have been incredibly active. In May, they actually arrested the head of their Supreme Court for taking bribes for favorable rulings. This month, one of the most powerful oligarchs in the country, who was a former supporter of President Zelensky, has been arrested and is in detention on fraud charges. And to the naked eye, so many new corruption investigations and arrests look bad, but if you sweep your floor, you're going to find dirt. And that's what you want to see, because it's not surprising that there is much more greater political will to tackle corruption right now, because when people fight for their country, they feel they have a say in how the country is run. And that's something Americans intrinsically identify with. Freedom is built into the lore of our country. And Ukrainians are learning in the most painful and horrific way that old adage that freedom isn't free. And all of this is because Russians use corruption in other countries the same way they use it in their own country, to influence and control. So many Ukrainian scholars have done a lot of soul searching in the past year and a half about how to talk about Ukraine. Before the war, much of Ukrainian history was framed by its relation to Russia. And people are now starting to move away from that. But there are some still important points related to Russia that need to be understood. I recently got a hold of a copy of a brand new Russian 11th grade history textbook. It was published just this year. And I perused it because they are working incredibly hard to reframe history to justify the war and shore up their us versus the West mentality. And something I find amusing, because it's so on the news actually, is if you look at the cover of that book, on that is the Crimean Bridge. So that Russia built that between the mainland and Crimea after they occupied it in 1924. So they're front loading that up there. But in the very first page, it has this nice little section that says, the main result of this course is to form Russian civic identity and patriotism among students. We hear a lot about Russian propaganda and information operations. Years ago, before I was a law student, actually myself and Joshua worked in that field. But one of the reasons that we talk about them being so effective is because they take a fact or some commonly accepted idea, and they do one of two things. And the first is they'll take a fact, put it in with a ton of junk, shake it up, and send it out through traditional and non-traditional media channels. For example, when Prigozhin was killed flying out of Moscow, there were a slew of narratives. It was a Ukrainian missile. Putin ordered him killed. There was a malfunction because of sanctions. He's not actually dead. And NATO. They always just throw in NATO, something NATO did. But the other thing they do is they take facts and change the context, compare them with other unrelated facts to make what we would think of as traditional propaganda. But these red sections here were from the Special Military Operations section that was added for this version. And for those that don't know, it's actually illegal in Russia to call the war in Ukraine a war. So they call it a special military operation in their news and official documents. And that first one says, Russia thought the Cold War was behind us. We believed that the future would be neighborly relations with the US and the West. On September 11th, 2001, Vladimir Putin was the first head of state to pass his condolences to the American people. The second one says, European energy independence didn't suit the US. In the name of profits for its corporations, the US constantly resorted to military terroristic methods. That's what happened in Iraq, Syria, Libya, and many other places on the planet. And finally, the third one says, Ukrainian neo-Nazism is the angry national linguistic cultural violence of a minority against the majority. After all, 80% of the population were native Russian speakers before 2014, and they weren't afraid to declare it. All the recent presidents of Ukraine were originally Russian-speaking and didn't even speak Ukrainian before taking office. They learned it for the elections. So some of those things are true and some of them are not. 80% of the population weren't native Russian speakers, but they did and likely still do speak it. Education in the 90s was in Russian, and some of the top universities taught in Russian. But at home with their friends, people would speak Ukrainian. After 2014, many people did, and especially even more since the war, make a conscious decision to speak only Ukrainian, even if they were bilingual. But I recently spoke with a friend of mine, the friend in Kharkiv, who speaks Russian. He and his wife understand both languages, but it's easier for him to speak Russian and for her to speak Ukrainian. And that's how they communicate, and that's actually quite common. But I asked him, I said, if he thought about switching, and he said, no, Putin doesn't own the Russian language. It's my language. And he also had some other things to say about Putin. But and this us versus them mentality that Russia is fostering even has a direct impact on South Carolina. So I haven't been able to get the official documents. I tried going to the MVD official website where you're supposed to be able to download documents, but it's basically their FBI. And according to Russian state media, a warrant was issued for Senator Lindsey Graham, his arrest after he met with President Zelensky in Ukraine. Of course, naturally, Senator Graham's response was just dripping with South Carolina snark. And he was like, here's an offer to my Russian friends who want to arrest and try me for calling out the Putin regime as being war criminals. I will submit to the jurisdiction of the ICC if you do. And he has it right. It's important to understand that Russia's belligerence has a direct impact on us. This is how they are working to eliminate the Ukrainian language, culture, and Ukrainians themselves in order to steal land that doesn't belong to them. But it's also how they are coming for us. Russian attacks on other countries, as well as action against the US in the form of cyber attacks and information warfare, are constantly working to put pressure on our economy, our social bonds, and our military operations and systems. And we have a two-pronged responsibility to face down threats, both as Americans and as legal practitioners. The first responsibility is to our country, to shore up our strength and sometimes be that reluctant gunfighter. The second is to protect, develop, and refine our own legal system to remind people in other countries what justice looks like. And as lawyers and future lawyers, that's our job. And you may be wondering, what right does some law student have to speak about these grandiose topics? But I'll tell you why I'm inspired to do so. The days after attacks, bombings, tend to be more somber. There's usually a nervous energy in the air, mixed with the tiredness that comes from being up listening to bombs. Being a soldier in a war zone is one type of experience, but being a civilian in a war zone is markedly different. You have to keep showing up at work, you have to take your kids to school, life goes on. But the afternoon after the attack, the university had scheduled some cultural events for the handful of foreign students to experience some aspects of Ukrainian culture. And this couple that you see on the screen talked about the Vyshyvanka, which is the traditionally embroidered shirts they have in Ukraine. He's actually wearing one. It was also their 10th wedding anniversary, and they were very much in love. He's also a combat photographer. But This mother and daughter are Ukrainian Americans, and it was their first trip back to Ukraine since the war started. It was actually a really serendipitous meeting. The mother was an anthropologist and is a professor here in the States, but I didn't have any idea who she was, and we were talking, and she was telling me things, and I was like, hey, that sounds like a book I have in my backpack. And she was like, what's the name? And she said, that's my book. She was actually the author of a book I had in my backpack, but she very kindly autographed it for me. But the day was really special because it was a Ukrainian folk holiday called Ivan Kupalo. And the tradition had girls make those wreaths that you see on their heads and then put candles on them and place them into the water. And where the wreath floated, it was supposed to predict a girl's romantic future. And boys then would jump into the water and in the hopes of capturing the wreath of the girl they loved so they could marry her. And they still celebrate this holiday, right? I mean, I'm not sure if anyone believes in the magic, maybe they do, but there is, however, magic alive in a people under siege who are saving their traditions, language, and culture from the fire of a country that wants to burn all of it from the face of the earth. There's a lot of aid in the form of military and economic support that we can give to Ukraine, but there's also a lot that we can learn from their culture and their strength. So, step outside of your comfort zone, and you won't regret it. Thank you.